Detective Ray Coleman thought he owned the streets of downtown Chicago. For 12 long years, he had walked those same blocks with his badge gleaming and his attitude even shinier. Every morning, he would look at himself in the mirror, adjust his uniform, and head out with the same mindset that had gotten him in trouble more times than anyone cared to count. The thing about Ray was that he never learned from his mistakes. Other officers would mess up, get written up, and change their ways. Not Ray. He saw every complaint against him as proof that the world was too soft, too politically correct for real police work. In his mind, he was the last honest cop in a department full of people who had forgotten what it meant to serve and protect. His locker at the precinct told the whole story. Inside, tucked behind his spare uniform and energy bars, were copies of every complaint filed against him. 17 official complaints in 12 years. Most officers never see one in their entire career. Ray collected them like trophies. Each piece of paper represented what he called doing his job the right way, while everyone else played politics. Captain Torres had called Ray into his office so many times that the chair across from his desk might as well have had Ray's name on it. The conversations always went the same way. Torres would slide a folder across the desk, Ray would glance at it without really reading, and then would come the lecture about community relations and proper procedures. Ray would nod at all the right moments, say what Torres wanted to hear, and walk out planning to do exactly what he had always done. The complaints painted a clear picture, though Ray never saw it that way. Mrs. Johnson from 5th Street said Ray had pulled her son over 3 times in 1 month for looking suspicious while walking to work. The Martinez family claimed Ray had searched their car during a routine traffic stop, tearing apart their interior while their young children watched and cried. Then there was the incident at the grocery store, where Ray had handcuffed a college student for what he called disrespectful behavior, but what witnesses described as simply asking why he was being questioned. What made Ray's situation even more complicated was his family connections. His uncle had been a sergeant in the same precinct for 25 years before retiring with full honors. His brother-in-law worked in internal affairs. His cousin was married to a city council member. These relationships had formed an invisible shield around Ray, protecting him from consequences that would have ended any other officer's career years ago. The other officers at the precinct had mixed feelings about Ray. Some genuinely liked him, because he could be charming and funny when he wanted to be. He was the guy who organized the annual barbecue and always remembered everyone's birthday. But most of his colleagues had learned to keep their distance. They had seen how he operated on the streets, and they didn't want any part of it. Officer Lisa Park had been Ray's partner for 6 months before requesting a transfer. She later told friends that riding with Ray was like watching a disaster in slow motion. He would approach every situation with an attitude that seemed designed to make things worse instead of better. Where other officers might start with a friendly greeting and a question, Ray would begin with commands and accusations. Lisa had tried to talk to him about it, but Ray always had an excuse or explanation that somehow made everyone else the problem. The training sessions were particularly telling. Every year, all officers had to attend workshops on cultural sensitivity, de-escalation techniques, and community policing. Ray would sit in the back row, arms crossed, with a look on his face that clearly said he thought the whole thing was a waste of time. During role-playing exercises, he would go through the motions but never really engage with the material. The instructors had learned not to call on him unless absolutely necessary, because his responses often made the room uncomfortable. What Ray didn't realize was that his reputation had spread far beyond his own precinct. Other departments in the city knew about him. Community leaders had his name on their lips during town halls and city council meetings. Local news reporters had a file with his name on it, waiting for the right story to break. Social media groups dedicated to police accountability mentioned him regularly, sharing stories and warning people to be extra careful during any interaction with him. The irony was that Ray genuinely believed he was one of the good guys. In his mind, crime was getting worse because officers like him were being held back by red tape and political correctness. He saw himself as a warrior fighting against the decline of law and order, someone willing to do what others wouldn't. This self-image made him feel justified in bending rules and pushing boundaries that other officers respected. His personal life reflected his professional attitudes. Ray lived alone in a small apartment across town, decorated with law enforcement memorabilia and old action movie posters. He spent his evenings on internet forums, complaining about department policies and sharing stories with like-minded people who reinforced his worldview. His social circle had shrunk over the years as friends and family grew tired of his constant complaints about work and society in general. The warning signs were everywhere, but the system kept failing to act decisively. Ray's supervisors would document problems, mandate additional training, and issue warnings, but they never took the final step of removing him from the streets. Part of this was bureaucratic inertia, part was his family connections, and part was the general difficulty of firing a police officer even when the evidence was overwhelming. As Ray approached his 13th year on the force, he had developed an almost supernatural confidence in his own immunity. He had survived complaints that would have destroyed other careers. He had been shuffled between different assignments and partners, but he always landed on his feet. In his mind, this proved that he was right and everyone else was wrong. He had no way of knowing that his luck was about to run out in the most spectacular way possible. The stage was set for a confrontation that would finally provide the wake-up call Ray had been avoiding his entire career. All the complaints, all the warnings, all the second chances had led to this moment when his prejudices and poor judgment would collide with someone he couldn't intimidate, couldn't dismiss, and definitely couldn't afford to cross. The question wasn't whether Ray would finally face consequences for his actions, but whether those consequences would be career-ending or life-changing in ways he never imagined possible. Tuesday morning started like any other day for FBI Director Patricia Williams. She had flown into Chicago the night before for what her staff called a community engagement initiative, but what she privately thought of as damage control. Recent tensions between federal and local law enforcement had reached a boiling point, and her presence was needed to smooth things over before they got worse. The meeting had been scheduled months in advance, but recent events had given it new urgency. 3 federal investigations into local police departments were making headlines, and community leaders were demanding answers. Patricia knew that showing up in person, rather than sending a deputy, would send the right message about how seriously the FBI was taking these concerns. She had spent most of her career building bridges between different law enforcement agencies. As someone who had worked her way up from field agent to the director's office, she understood both sides of the federal-local divide. Local cops often saw federal agents as outsiders who didn't understand street-level policing. Federal agents sometimes viewed local departments as unprofessional or corrupt. Patricia's job was to find common ground and make both sides work together. The morning meeting had gone better than expected. Community leaders had been direct but respectful in their concerns. Local police chiefs had listened without getting defensive. By lunchtime, Patricia felt like real progress had been made. The kind of progress that doesn't make headlines but prevents the kind of incidents that destroy trust between police and the communities they serve. Her security detail wanted her to head straight back to the hotel after the meeting, but Patricia had other plans. She had learned over the years that the real conversations happen outside conference rooms. If she wanted to understand what was really happening in Chicago, she needed to walk the streets and talk to regular people going about their day. Agent Rodriguez, her lead security officer, wasn't thrilled with the idea. "Ma'am, we haven't had time to scout the area properly. There are too many variables we haven't accounted for." But Patricia had made up her mind. She would take a minimal security presence and spend an hour walking through downtown, stopping to chat with anyone who wanted to talk. The compromise they reached was typical Patricia Williams. She would dress casually, carry only her badge and service weapon, and take 2 agents who would keep their distance. To anyone watching, she would look like just another professional taking a lunch break and enjoying the spring weather. Her Miliasam security team would be there, but invisible unless something went wrong. Downtown Chicago was bustling with the usual mix of office workers, tourists, and street vendors. Patricia had forgotten how much she enjoyed being around regular people. After spending so much time in government buildings and conference rooms, she stopped to buy a hot dog from a vendor who didn't recognize her, chatted with a group of college students who were taking selfies, and even helped an elderly man who was having trouble with a parking meter. The walk was doing exactly what she had hoped. Instead of reading reports about community relations, she was experiencing them firsthand. The conversations were brief but real. People talked about their jobs, their families, their hopes for the city. A few recognized her and thanked her for coming to Chicago. Others had no idea who she was and treated her like any other friendly stranger. What Patricia didn't know was that Detective Ray Coleman was having one of his worst days in months. He had started his shift with a lecture from Captain Torres about his attitude problem. Then he had been assigned to foot patrol in the downtown area, which he considered punishment duty. Real cops, in Ray's opinion, drove patrol cars and responded to serious calls. Walking around downtown talking to tourists and office workers was something they gave to rookies and officers who had screwed up. Ray's mood had gotten worse as the day progressed. He had been hoping for some real action, maybe a robbery or at least a good drug bust. Instead, he had spent 3 hours doing what he called community relations nonsense. He had handed out directions to lost tourists, told some teenagers to move along from a bench they weren't supposed to be sitting on, and filled out paperwork for a minor fender bender. The combination of his bad mood and his natural suspicion made Ray see problems where none existed. When he spotted what he described later as a suspicious individual near the federal building, every one of his worst instincts kicked in at once. Here was someone who didn't fit his mental picture of who belonged in that area, walking with purpose but without the typical tourist or office worker look. Patricia was actually heading toward a coffee shop that Agent Rodriguez had recommended when Ray first spotted her. She was checking her phone to see if she had time for coffee before her next meeting when she noticed someone watching her. Years of training had taught her to be aware of her surroundings, but she didn't feel threatened. Downtown Chicago in the middle of the day was about as safe as any place could be. Ray, meanwhile, was running through his mental checklist of what made someone worth stopping and questioning. In his 12 years on the force, he had developed what he thought was an eye for trouble. The reality was that his instincts were heavily influenced by his prejudices, but he had never learned to recognize that distinction. The decision to approach Patricia was made in a split second, based on assumptions that Ray didn't even realize he was making. He saw someone who didn't match his idea of who belonged in that space, and his training told him to investigate. The problem was that Ray's version of investigation always started with confrontation rather than conversation. Patricia noticed the officer approaching but didn't think much of it. She had interacted with thousands of police officers throughout her career, and most encounters were professional and brief. She expected this would be the same. Maybe he would ask if she needed directions or if she had seen anything unusual in the area. The federal building loomed behind them, its windows reflecting the afternoon sun. Office workers walked past, most too busy with their own lives to pay attention to what was about to become a moment that would change everything for everyone involved. Security cameras that were supposed to protect people were about to record an incident that would be replayed on news programs across the country. Neither Patricia nor Ray understood that they were about to participate in a confrontation that would expose everything wrong with police training, community relations, and the assumptions people make about who belongs where. The next few minutes would turn a routine afternoon into a career-ending disaster for one person and a teachable moment for an entire nation. The moment Detective Ray Coleman opened his mouth, Patricia Williams knew this wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. His voice was loud and aggressive, the kind of tone that immediately made everyone within 50 feet stop what they were doing and turn to look. Ray planted himself directly in Patricia's path, his hand resting on his belt in a way that was clearly meant to intimidate. "Hold up right there," Ray barked, pointing his finger at Patricia like she was already guilty of something. "I need to see some identification, and I need to see it right now." His voice carried that particular edge that some officers develop when they think they're dealing with someone who won't be able to fight back. Patricia stopped walking and took a calm breath. In her 25 years with the FBI, she had been in countless tense situations. But this was different. This was a police officer who clearly had no idea who she was, making assumptions based on nothing more than her appearance. She could see the aggression in his posture, the way he was already treating her like a criminal before she had said a single word. "Good afternoon, officer," Patricia said in her most professional voice. "Is there something I can help you with Today? She kept her hands visible and her tone respectful, even though every instinct told her this situation was about to get much worse before it got better. Ray didn't like her calm response. In his experience, innocent people were supposed to be nervous when a police officer approached them. The fact that Patricia seemed so composed only made him more suspicious. "Don't give me that attitude," he snapped. "I asked you a question. Where's your ID?" People on the sidewalk were starting to slow down and stare. A businessman with a briefcase had stopped completely, pretending to check his phone while clearly listening to every word. Two women coming out of the nearby Starbucks had paused by the door, their coffee cups forgotten as they watched the scene unfold. Patricia reached slowly into her jacket pocket, moving deliberately so there could be no misunderstanding about what she was doing. "I'm going to reach for my credentials now," she announced clearly, both for Ray's benefit and for the growing crowd of onlookers. Her FBI badge and identification were in her inside pocket, right where they always were, but Ray's training had taught him to see threats everywhere, and his prejudices made him interpret every movement as potentially dangerous. The moment Patricia's hand disappeared into her jacket, his own hand moved to his service weapon. "Stop right there," he shouted, his voice rising to a level that made people across the street turn to look. "Keep your hands where I can see them." The situation was escalating exactly the way Patricia had seen happen so many times in training videos and case studies. An officer with poor judgment making assumptions, a citizen trying to comply with conflicting demands, and a crowd of witnesses watching everything spiral out of control. She knew she had to de-escalate quickly before someone got hurt. "Officer, I'm an FBI agent," Patricia said clearly, keeping her voice steady despite the absurdity of the situation. "My credentials are in my jacket pocket. I'm reaching for them slowly so you can verify my identity." She moved her hand inch by inch, making sure Ray could see exactly what she was doing. Ray's response was immediate and completely wrong. Instead of asking for clarification or calling for backup to help sort out the situation, he drew his weapon and pointed it directly at Patricia's chest. "I said don't move!" he screamed, his gun now trained on the FBI director in broad daylight on a busy Chicago street. The crowd that had been casually watching suddenly realized they were witnessing something much more serious than a routine police stop. Several people immediately pulled out their phones and started recording. Others backed away quickly, not wanting to be caught in whatever was about to happen next. A few brave souls stayed close enough to serve as witnesses, understanding instinctively that this was the kind of situation where having multiple perspectives would be important. Patricia felt time slow down the way it always did in truly dangerous situations. She had a gun pointed at her by a police officer who clearly had no idea what he was doing. Her own training told her to remain calm, follow orders, and wait for backup. But she also knew that Ray was making decisions based on panic and prejudice, which made him unpredictable and dangerous. "Officer, please lower your weapon," Patricia said, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to being listened to. "I am FBI Director Patricia Williams. My security detail is nearby and this situation needs to be resolved peacefully before anyone gets hurt." Ray's mind was racing, but not in a productive way. He had committed to this course of action when he drew his weapon and his pride wouldn't let him back down. In his twisted logic, if this person really was who she claimed to be, she would have identified herself immediately instead of reaching into her pocket. The fact that she seemed so calm only convinced him that she was lying. "I don't care who you say you are," Ray shouted, his gun still pointed at Patricia's center mass. "You could be anybody. I've seen fake badges before. I've seen people try to talk their way out of situations. You're going to get on the ground right now, or this is going to get a lot worse for you." That's when Agent Rodriguez appeared, seeming to materialize out of nowhere the way good security personnel do. He had been watching from a distance, but the moment Ray drew his weapon, Rodriguez moved into position. He approached slowly, his own credentials clearly visible, speaking in the calm voice that comes from years of training. "Chicago PD, this is Agent Rodriguez, FBI. You have drawn your weapon on FBI Director Patricia Williams. I need you to lower your weapon immediately and step back." Rodriguez kept his own hands visible, not wanting to give Ray any excuse to claim he felt threatened by federal agents. Ray's head snapped toward Rodriguez, his gun wavering between the two federal agents. This was the moment when a smart officer would have realized his mistake and tried to de-escalate. Instead, Ray doubled down on his error. "How do I know you're really FBI?" he demanded. "Anyone can get fake credentials. Anyone can claim to be federal agents." More backup was arriving now, but not the kind Ray was expecting. Agent Thompson, Patricia's other security officer, had called for immediate assistance from both the FBI field office and Chicago PD supervisors. Within minutes, the area was swarming with law enforcement officers who all understood exactly how badly Ray had messed up. Captain Torres arrived on scene just as Ray was demanding that both federal agents get on the ground. Torres took one look at the situation and immediately understood that one of his officers was having a career-ending moment in front of multiple cameras and dozens of witnesses. The question wasn't whether Ray would face consequences, but whether those consequences would include federal charges for threatening federal officers. The confrontation had lasted less than 5 minutes, but it felt like hours to everyone involved. Ray still had his gun drawn, still convinced he was handling a dangerous situation correctly. Patricia remained calm but alert, knowing that scared officers with drawn weapons were always dangerous. The crowd continued to grow, with more phones, recording every second of what was clearly going to be national news within hours. Captain Torres couldn't believe what he was seeing. After 28 years in law enforcement, he thought he had witnessed every possible way an officer could mess up. But watching Detective Ray Coleman hold the FBI director at gunpoint in broad daylight was something entirely new, even for someone who had seen it all. "Coleman!" Torres shouted, his voice carrying the kind of authority that had commanded respect for decades. "Lower your weapon immediately. That's a direct order." Torres had dealt with Ray's problems for years, but this was beyond anything he could have imagined. This wasn't just another complaint or another incident report. This was a career-ending, department-damaging, possibly criminal disaster happening in real time. Ray's head turned toward his captain, confusion clouding his face. For the first time since drawing his weapon, doubt began to creep into his mind. Captain Torres wasn't someone who got rattled easily. If Torres was this upset, maybe Ray had made a mistake, but his pride and stubbornness wouldn't let him admit error, especially not in front of a growing crowd of witnesses. "Captain, these people are claiming to be federal agents, but anyone can get fake credentials," Ray said, his gun still pointed at Patricia Williams. "I'm following proper procedure for suspicious individuals who might be impersonating law enforcement officers." Even as he said it, Ray could hear how weak his argument sounded. Torres stepped closer, his voice dropping to a tone that Ray had never heard before. It was the voice of a man who was watching one of his officers destroy not just his own career, but potentially the reputation of the entire department. "Coleman, I am ordering you for the last time. Lower your weapon and step back. Do it now, or you will face immediate termination and criminal charges." The crowd had grown to nearly 50 people now, forming a loose circle around the confrontation. Office workers had come out of nearby buildings. Shoppers had stopped their afternoon errands. Even delivery drivers had parked their trucks to watch what was clearly going to be talked about for years to come. Most importantly, at least a dozen phones were recording every second of the encounter. Patricia Williams had remained remarkably calm throughout the entire ordeal, but she could see that the situation was reaching a tipping point. Ray was clearly struggling with the realization that he had made a massive mistake, but he was also trapped by his own actions. Men with guns who felt cornered were always dangerous, regardless of what uniform they wore. "Officer Coleman," Patricia said, using his name for the first time. "I understand this is a difficult situation, but we need to resolve it safely. Your captain is here now, my security team is here. Everyone wants this to end peacefully." Her voice carried the kind of authority that came from years of talking people down from bad decisions. Agent Rodriguez had positioned himself where he could act quickly if necessary, but he was also careful not to escalate the situation further. Federal agents drawing weapons on local police officers would create an entirely different set of problems, even when the local officer was clearly in the wrong. The goal was to end this without anyone getting hurt, and without creating an incident that would damage federal-local law enforcement relationships for decades. Ray's hand was shaking slightly now, the weight of his mistake finally beginning to sink in. The confident aggression that had carried him through 12 years of problematic policing was crumbling, as he realized that this time, there would be no protection from his family connections, no way to explain away his actions, no second chance to make things right. "I was just doing my job," Ray said, but his voice lacked conviction. She looked suspicious. She was reaching into her jacket. "I had to protect myself and the public." The words sounded hollow even to him, especially with Captain Torres staring at him like he had never seen him before. Torres had reached his limit. In a voice that could be heard clearly by everyone in the crowd, he said, "Detective Coleman, you have just held the FBI Director of the United States at gunpoint based on nothing more than your own prejudices and poor judgment. Lower your weapon immediately, or I will have other officers disarm you by force." The moment Torres identified Patricia Williams by her full title, the crowd's reaction was immediate and audible. Gasps, whispers, and the sound of more phones being pulled out to record what everyone now understood was a historic moment. The FBI director being threatened by a local police officer wasn't just news. It was the kind of story that would lead national broadcasts and dominate social media for weeks. Ray's face went pale as the full magnitude of his mistake hit him like a physical blow. FBI director, not just a federal agent, not just someone with credentials, but the person who ran the entire Federal Bureau of Investigation, the person whose job it was to investigate police departments, the person who could end careers with a phone call. With trembling hands, Ray slowly lowered his weapon and holstered it. The relief in the crowd was palpable, but everyone understood that while the immediate danger had passed, the consequences were just beginning. Ray stood there looking lost, like a man who had just watched his entire life collapse in the space of 5 minutes. Patricia Williams handled the moment with the professionalism that had carried her to the top of federal law enforcement. Instead of expressing anger or demanding immediate arrests, she approached Ray with the calm authority of someone who understood that how she handled the next few minutes would be remembered and analyzed for years to come. "Officer Coleman," she said, "I accept that you believed you were doing your job. However, this incident highlights exactly why we need better training and better communication between federal and local law enforcement. I hope we can use this as a learning opportunity for everyone involved." But while Patricia was showing remarkable grace under pressure, the machinery of consequences was already in motion. Agent Rodriguez was on his radio, reporting the incident to FBI headquarters. Captain Torres was making calls that would bring internal affairs, the mayor's office, and eventually reporters to the scene. The phones recording everything would soon upload videos that would be shared thousands of times before dinner. Ray stood there watching his career evaporate in real time. 12 years of service, however problematic, were about to be reduced to a single moment of spectacularly bad judgment. The protection his family connections had provided for over a decade wouldn't matter now. No one could shield him from the consequences of pointing a gun at the FBI director. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Within an hour, Ray was in Captain Torres's office, officially suspended pending investigation. By evening, the story was trending on social media. By the next morning, it would be national news. The man who had thought himself untouchable had just learned that there are some lines even protected officers can't cross. By 6 o'clock that evening, Ray Coleman's life as he knew it was over. He sat in his small apartment staring at his phone as notification after notification popped up. Friends, family members, and former colleagues were all sending him the same thing. Video after video of his confrontation with FBI Director Patricia Williams, shared across every social media platform imaginable. The footage was everywhere. Someone had counted at least 15 different angles of the incident, from cell phone videos taken by bystanders to security camera footage from nearby buildings. The hashtag FBI Director Threatened was trending nationally, with millions of views and thousands of comments. Most of the comments weren't kind to Ray. The call from Captain Torres came at exactly 6:47 p.m. Ray knew what it was about before he even answered. Torres' voice was flat, official, and final. "Coleman, effective immediately. You are terminated from the Chicago Police Department. Your badge, weapon, and all department property must be returned by tomorrow morning. Personnel will contact you about the administrative details. Ray tried to speak, to offer some explanation or ask for another chance, but Torres cut him off. There's nothing to discuss, Coleman. You pointed a loaded weapon at the FBI director based on nothing but your own assumptions. There is no coming back from that. Ever. After Torres hung up, Ray sat in silence for a long time. 12 years of his life, gone in a single afternoon. The pension he had been counting on for retirement, eliminated. The career that had defined his identity, erased. All because he couldn't see past his own prejudices long enough to do his job properly. The media attention was unlike anything the Chicago Police Department had ever experienced. By the next morning, news vans lined the street outside headquarters. Reporters from local stations, national networks, and cable news channels all wanted to know the same thing. How does a police officer with 17 complaints against him stay on the force long enough to threaten the FBI director? Mayor Johnson held a press conference that morning, flanked by Captain Torres and the police superintendent. The mayor's message was clear and direct. What happened yesterday represents a complete failure of judgment that does not reflect the values of our police department or our city. The officer involved has been terminated, and we are conducting a full review of our hiring, training, and disciplinary procedures. But the political consequences were just beginning. City council members who had been silent about police reform for years suddenly had strong opinions about accountability and oversight. The federal investigation that Patricia Williams had been trying to avoid became inevitable. 3 separate congressional committees announced they would be holding hearings about police training and federal-local law enforcement cooperation. Patricia Williams handled the media attention with the same professionalism she had shown during the incident itself. At a press conference in Washington, she used the moment to talk about the broader issues the confrontation had highlighted. This incident shows us why we need better communication, better training, and better understanding between different levels of law enforcement, she said. But it also shows us what happens when officers make decisions based on assumptions rather than facts. Ray's family connections, which had protected him for so long, suddenly became liabilities. His uncle, the retired sergeant, found himself answering uncomfortable questions about how he had influenced Ray's career. His brother-in-law in internal affairs was reassigned pending an investigation into whether family relationships had affected disciplinary decisions. His cousin's spouse on the city council faced calls for an ethics investigation. The 17 complaints that had been filed against Ray over the years were suddenly front-page news. Mrs. Johnson, whose son Ray had harassed, repeatedly gave interviews describing how she had tried to get someone to listen to her concerns. The Martinez family appeared on a national morning show, talking about how Ray had traumatized their children during a traffic stop. The college student Ray had handcuffed at the grocery store started a social media campaign about police accountability. Ray tried to find another job in law enforcement, but his reputation had preceded him to every department within 1,000 miles. The video of him threatening the FBI director played every time his name was searched online. No police chief in the country wanted to be the person who hired the officer who had pointed a gun at Patricia Williams. He applied for security jobs, but even private companies were hesitant to hire someone with his background. The incident had made him a liability that no employer wanted to take on. The man who had once felt untouchable now couldn't even get an interview for a mall security position. The financial consequences hit hard and fast. Without his police salary, Ray couldn't afford his apartment. His pension was gone, along with his health insurance and all the benefits he had been counting on. He moved back in with his elderly parents, sleeping in his childhood bedroom while trying to figure out what to do with the rest of his life. The psychological impact was even worse than the financial damage. Ray had built his entire identity around being a police officer. It wasn't just his job, it was who he was. Without the badge and uniform, he felt lost and purposeless. The respect he thought he had earned over 12 years had evaporated overnight, replaced by recognition as the officer who had made one of the most spectacularly bad decisions in law enforcement history. FBI Director Williams used the incident as a catalyst for the police reform discussions she had been advocating for years. The confrontation became a case study in police training academies across the country, used to teach new officers about the importance of de-escalation and the dangers of making assumptions based on prejudice. A year later, Ray was working at a warehouse on the outskirts of Chicago, loading trucks for minimum wage. His coworkers knew who he was, the story had been too big to forget, but most of them left him alone. He spent his days in anonymity, doing repetitive physical labor that required no judgment calls or split-second decisions. Sometimes during his lunch breaks, Ray would think about that Tuesday afternoon and wonder how different his life might have been if he had simply asked Patricia Williams if she needed help, instead of immediately assuming she was a threat. One moment of poor judgment, one decision based on prejudice rather than professionalism, had cost him everything he thought he valued. The incident became a permanent reminder that in law enforcement, there are consequences for crossing certain lines. No amount of family connections, departmental protection, or personal confidence can save an officer who points a weapon at the FBI director. Ray Coleman had learned that lesson the hardest way possible, and his story became a warning to every officer who thought they were above accountability. The badge that had once made him feel powerful now belonged to someone else. The career that had defined him was over, and the man who had thought he owned the streets of Chicago discovered that the streets had moved on without him, indifferent to his fall from grace and focused on the officers who understood that real police work means protecting everyone, regardless of their own personal prejudices.